Welcome back to the Coordinated Chaos podcast. I'm your host, Georgia, and I'm just your type B bestie going deep on all things but behind the scenes of building a business, women's health, and life's defining moments. Episode 3. In episode 2, we talked about my Canadian adventure and all the things that happened there and the lessons and the growth that I had while I was away. So if you haven't listened to it, go back and have a listen because it kind of does tie into some of the things we're talking about today. But today's topic is my founder story. From adopted to entrepreneur. So if you also listen to the first episode, you will know that I am adopted and I want to speak about it more on this platform, and I want to bring more light to the experiences that I've had as an adopted person. And yeah, today's going to be diving into all things about it. My journey from being adopted at 4 months old to feeling kind of lost in my identity and confused about what I wanted to do for my career to running my own business in one of the most underrated and impactful careers possible. I have notes today, and I'm going to be reading probably quite a lot from them because today I'm going to be diving deep on the psychology of child development for adoption. I'm going to be diving deep into some of the things that I've learned along the way, or things that have prompted me to want to talk more about this. So if I'm looking down and you're watching this, that's why. I want to make sure that this is a really good episode, like I do with every episode. But if I'm looking down, that's why. Okay, now let's... Oh, such a good sound. We're going to have the Coke Zero on the side there, just for a little bit of a zhuzh and a bit of energy in this one. We're going to talk about this. So I just want to talk about my adoption from my perspective because, one, I think it's very interesting. Two, I think elements of what I'm going to talk about today will resonate with other people that may have had similar or slightly different backgrounds and understood by other people. And three, it's been something that's impacted my journey and still does today. This conversation is my story. It's my perspective, and I think it's important to pre-frame that and say that my experience has been individual to me. And I'm not looking for anything out of this other than to share a story, the experience that I've had, and the continued benefits that I have had by diving deep into growing my awareness of what it's been like to be adopted. When I was born, my birth mother didn't know she was pregnant, and she was about 19 or 20. This kind of pregnancy is called a cryptic pregnancy or a stealth pregnancy. It occurs roughly in 1 to 475 women by 20 weeks. So they don't know until 20 weeks, which is, halfway or so, right? And then 1 in 2,500 by the time they're giving birth and delivering the baby. So that gives you an idea of how kind of rare it is, but it is a thing. And I actually know some people that have been in this situation before, and I'm really excited to get them on the pod and get their perspective as well. So I was born on the 24th of June, 1990, and roughly 2 days later, I was already in foster care with a beautiful family that gave me everything that I needed for the first 4 months of my life, whilst the adoption process was happening in the background. At 4 months old, on the 24th of October 1990, I was adopted into a family, the Morgan family. I was adopted by my mum, Patricia, my dad, Michael, and my brother, Jared, who was their biological son, and he was 8 years old at that time. I'm also going to get my mum to come on the podcast and speak about it from her perspective as well, because again, another different perspective that's individual and very interesting. And I'd just love to learn more about how she felt in the entire process and shine a light on that experience as well. So that is one to look forward to as well. As you know, this is going to be an ongoing theme throughout the podcast bit by bit. So lock in. we're in it for the long haul on this story. So as the story goes, when I was a young toddler, I asked my mum one day something along the lines of, how come I have different color hair to you? She's brunette, my dad was brunette, my brother was brunette, and I was blonde, curly hair. And that was what opened up the discussion of adoption. And in my opinion, it was probably the best possible way to know about my history without having a relationship with my birth mother. My upbringing was full of love, affection, and care. I had every single opportunity that a child could ever want. I was growing up in great schools, did a lot of sport, I did dancing. I literally had every opportunity possible for me to have the best upbringing ever. Family holidays, and everything was normal and fantastic. I grew up being curious and asking lots of questions. And for the most part, I felt indifferent about my situation. I didn't understand what could have been if it hadn't have been the way it was, or who I could have been in another literal life. I recently listened to a podcast with James Smith, the PT, on his podcast, where he was in an interview with a psychology expert, Connor Beaton, and they talked about things like patterns of self-sabotage, the dynamics in relationships, and also addiction, and also the relationships of, and that relationship to high performers. If you didn't know this already, but James Smith PT is also adopted. And he also spoke about how he felt indifferent growing up and didn't really think much of his development, meaning that he processed things differently and that kind of thing. But in this interview, when he brought up that he was adopted, Connor actually stopped him and said that he had never met anyone who didn't have an attachment issue or attachment trauma. And that attachment that we have when we're first born is so crucial for our sense of belonging and long-term effective behaviors. And to be honest, that conversation was a big reason why I wanted to start this podcast, because it brought light to the fact that not that many people know about the effects of adoption on their development, on their sense of identity, on their behavior patterns. So I was really excited that this conversation had been brought to my attention, and I could also share my experience about it as well, because I feel like there is not just adopted people, but also people that have adopted children or people that have been in the foster system, that kind of thing, that could relate to this story and these things. And I think a lot of my experiences, as we'll talk about later down the track, I could have just lived through them and not really realized why I was acting in certain ways or behaving in certain ways. I wanted to really highlight that because I just felt like there wasn't much going on with it. Anyway, Connor said that when we have an attachment disruption as a child, our need for attachment doesn't go away. Our need for attachment just changes. So what happens is that if we don't attach to a human as per se from that early stages, and that can be a couple of days, it can be that you're moving around foster care, you're being given to different caregivers and passed around, our need for attachment just changes to being attached to behaviors, objects, or substances. So in the instance of James Smith, who's a very high achiever with a history of some substance abuse, and at the time of his substance use, labeled it as just partying, drinking a lot, going out a lot, meeting lots of girls, having lots of sex with girls, having these different kind of relationships. James actually resonated with that because he felt like he had sabotaged a lot of his performance in his life and his relationships so that he could feel something, or he was numbing, or he was avoiding what he really had to work through in order to have a healthy, stable relationship and life and get it done. He's done very well for himself, obviously. He is like a big figure in the fitness industry. He has multiple businesses, has a coaching business. He has like a mentoring business. He's got the new tonic drinks that he's launched recently. So he does really well for himself. But it wasn't until recently that he met a woman that he actually wanted to start a family with, and now he has a child as well. And I guess he must have worked through some of his things and realized like he was living a life that he didn't actually aspire to. He continued to talk about the fact that he wanted to have a family and go and live on like a property and all of the things, but then he never actually had the right actions that would align with that. And I think that was the biggest game changer for him. Connor also speaks about how high achievers use self-sabotage as a way to generate more fuel in their psyche and in their nervous system in order for them to get more results. I'm going to link the podcast that I listened to in the show notes. So if you're interested in hearing more about it, it'll be in the show notes there for you. Secondary to this, I want to talk about the psychology and the science behind childhood development in adoptees, and some of the ones that I felt were the most relevant to my situation. Adoption is a way to provide a secure environment that promotes positive development and healing from early adversity. However, some adopted children face higher risks for attachment, behavioral, and mental health challenges compared to non-adopted peers. Key developmental impacts include navigating loss, identity formation, and attachment and emotional regulation issues stemming from early life stress, and a lack of bonding with the mother or father figure, even in the earliest moments and days of a newborn's life, as well as both internal and external behavioral outcomes. Attachment and emotional development may include forming secure or insecure attachments. Some may struggle with presenting as anxious, avoidant, or displaying indiscriminate friendliness. So just meaning that like a child may be happy with whoever they're being passed around to and not really have that stranger danger alert, natural kind of like alarm bells going off when they're meeting new people. These issues can usually stem from early neglect and abuse or multiple caregiver changes, which may lead to difficulties with emotional regulation or low self-esteem and behavioral problems. Some of the behavioral outcomes adopted children are at higher risk for include externalizing behaviors such as hyperactivity or aggression, or internalizing problems like anxiety and depression. They also struggle with identity development through adolescence and often face challenges in forming a cohesive identity, especially in understanding their dual connections to birth and adoptive families. They may experience a closed or open book identity struggle and experience a sense of loss or confusion regarding their origin. On the flip side, a nurturing, stable, and supportive adoptive home is a strong factor for recovery, allowing these children to overcome early developmental deficits. I will also include a few of the articles and papers that I used to form that. Obviously, it's a little bit like sciencey, psychology heavy, but I think it's really important to highlight that and make sure that I'm using the correct sources and that kind of thing. So I'm going to include those in the show notes as well. So if you're interested in reading more about it, that will be there. One of the most impactful experiences that made my life that made me realize what could have been was when I was on placement in university at DHS in child protection, where I was working alongside a social worker in case management. We had to do site visits to family homes and schools to assess the safety of children. Around that time, I'd also gone through one of my first meaningful breakups. I was obviously sad that he had ended it, and a lot of anxious attachment feelings came up for me in that time. Feelings of not being chosen, feelings of a relationship failing, not fully understanding why we couldn't make it work, and going into families that were dysfunctional at that time, and they were still making it work in their relationships, albeit they were toxic, triggered me a lot. And my empathy for the children that were in these situations as well, I started to feel like that could have been me. And it brought up so many confusing emotions, if I'm being honest. Those experiences that I had in child protection were the beginning of the end of my social work career, because I realized it felt heavier and closer to my heart than I could handle. I also think that the first connection between seeing children in broken families and my experience with a relationship breakdown was the catalyst for my awareness of how I was responding and reacting to other relationships in my life. It may seem extreme to label it as abandonment, but those were the wounds that were showing up at the time. And later in life, I realized that's exactly what it was. I feared rejection deeply. I feared losing friendships if I was totally honest in my feelings. And I brushed off a lot of my true feelings under the rug. I struggled to openly communicate my feelings in a lot of situations for fear of losing them completely. So I usually just stayed quiet to avoid conflict. This led me to my first experience in therapy and counseling as well, where I learned that I process things differently in relationships and friendships. I also embodied people-pleasing tendencies. I listened when people told me I was too much, and I absorbed that. I stayed in relationships and friendships longer than I should have because I didn't want to upset, abandon, and reject other people. So as much as I was scared to be rejected, I also didn't want to inflict this pain that I felt on other people as well. I was constantly seeking external validation. But with therapy, I was able to unlearn some of that as well. And I was able to learn self-respect and unconditional self-worth. It's truly hard work though, and a lot of it is unconscious. You can't always think your way out of anxiety and panic attacks when it just really feels like that is true. Sometimes you can do all the talk therapy, the journaling, the self-reflecting, and build self-trust through actions, which has been a big one for me being in the fitness industry and doing a lot of physical work on myself. You still fight demons and battle with self-doubt, even though the awareness and the deep physical inner nervous system feelings of not enoughness are conflicting. So that's something that we're working on always. These challenges have surfaced in multiple different contexts across the journey of my life. After my other big breakup in 2019, where my partner struggled with his self-perception and wasn't willing to work through his own childhood trauma. When I was working through that experience and managing a gym in 2019 and feeling like my strengths in the role were clouded by my personal emotional struggles, including anxiety and panic attacks. And therefore, I was seen as weak and feeling too much, wearing it on my sleeve too much. And I was seen as unprofessional. I felt it when I moved across the world to Canada to find myself. And when I engaged in relationships with others who were avoidantly attached and they had their own issues of how they felt about themselves as well, I felt it then too. I felt it when I started my business as a sole trader in 2022. And I felt it when I realized that my personal health and fitness transformation was one where I healed my relationship with food and emotional eating. I felt it when I advocated for myself hard when I had a sleep disorder called sleep apnea. And my abnormally large tonsils were the reason why I was having disrupted sleep, resulting in a tonsillectomy, which has changed my recovery, my sleep, my mood, and my mental health enormously for the better. It was like I had to redefine and rebuild myself up over and over and over again, because I was haunted by all the past experiences and the self-doubt and the low self-worth that those things bring. They say that starting a business is development on crack, and I couldn't agree more. But with the right tools, the right modalities, and the courage to keep persevering and staying resilient in the face of adversity, I know that I will always survive these feelings. Life is always up and down. There's always going to be duality. And when you can accept that there's always going to be duality, it helps you move through these tough times a lot easier and quicker. For me, the strength and courage to continue despite feeling like I wasn't worthy, like I was misunderstood, like I was never enough, is my biggest flex. To now being a business owner, still figuring it out every single day, and having the strength and courage to be vulnerable and share my story, and also share stories of others who have been through it as well, is my version of resilience. And I couldn't be prouder of myself to be sitting here today and sharing this story with you. I used to go to therapy and share everything and just cry because I was so upset and sad for myself, and I felt like I was broken. And I know that some people will say, yeah, that's a victim mindset. But if I hadn't have outwardly processed those things, I never would have moved through those emotions. And I genuinely wouldn't have seen the other side of today and be building this business that I'm doing now. I know that these feelings will land where they're meant to. Even if your story is slightly different and you had a different upbringing, or you had a divorce in your parents divorced, or you had some abuse in your upbringing, I know that some of these elements will also resonate for you as well. Let me say this. Your worth is not conditional. Got goosebumps. You were born with worthiness, a place and a purpose on this earth. And if you ever feel lost and stuck in life, know that there are people and modalities that can change the way you think and feel about yourself. You can step into the person that you want to become and change the trajectory of your life so that you can build your dream life. It is your job and your responsibility to find that purpose, to pursue it, and share your story, your journey, because you never know who it's going to impact. This episode's prompt: if there was no noise, no history, no risks, and no one watching, what changes would you make in your life? Thank you so much for being here. This has been a big episode, and I know I want to be able to show different versions of myself, and I know the first couple have been somewhat meaningful and pretty deep and that kind of thing, but that's just who I am. I love going deep. I also love having fun. I also love my Coke Zero. So if you've loved this episode and you're really enjoying these episodes, please leave a comment. Let me know how you liked it. If there's something you want me to expand on more, let me know. Send me a DM, whatever it is. Follow me on Spotify and tune in again for the next installment of the Coordinated Chaos podcast. I love you so, 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 so much. And I'll see you next week for episode 4, where we're going to be having our first ever guest on the podcast. Can't wait to see you then. Have a great week. Love you all.